That was Toby Harvey. Very interesting interview. And speaking of interesting interviews, we are in the studio again with Geoff Martell from Stribling. He is the director of data and training, and our producer, Tony Simone, joined us. Is it data or data? You know, it's.
I'm a New Yorker, so I like data.
Potato, that sort of
Jesus
thing.
said the geek shall inherit the earth, or somebody said, Bill Gates, perhaps. And data is becoming so important to us now. And Nate Silver has really changed the landscape among many other people. And the data people are the ones that we go to now for all our knowledge and guidance. So what's going on, Geoff?
Well, you know, it's interesting because in the New York market, we struggle with essentially a problem of bad data. So there's no definitive source for data in the New York market. There's no MLS, much like the other sophisticated systems around the country. So oftentimes, say when these quarterly reports and market reports are coming out, people producing the reports have different ways of collecting the data and different methodologies. So I thought I would just take a few moments to talk a little bit about debunking and demystifying real estate statistics. In particular, I want to talk about what we read about in quarterly market reports. So, for instance, in the Q1 report that came out just a few weeks ago, Douglas Elliman, Corcoran Sunshine, a bunch of others produced a market report which said that the average price for condominiums and co-ops had reached an all-time high in 2015.
Like $2 million, right?
$2 million in the first quarter of 2016. Now, the problem with that is that, one, when real estate data comes to light, most of the people who are compiling the reports are using closed sales and recorded sales data. And if you work in the real estate world, you probably realize that recorded sales data is anywhere from 3 to 6 months behind the curve. So when you're looking at Q1 numbers, what you're actually looking at are numbers that for data that really had significance in 2015. So Tony, as you mentioned, 2 million was the number quoted by many market reports. And the problem is that many of the closings that happened in the first quarter of 2016, the contracts were signed in June 2015. And if you remember back to 2015, that was sort of the June and July was sort of when prices hit their other previous peak.
Well, I have a question. Sorry to interrupt, but because I know you can manipulate data to a degree. What about all these big mega sales now when you have these new developments where somebody's paying $90 million for a single apartment? Is that bringing the rise up then on the lower end?
That's a great question, and it's true. It is bringing up the average, right? So one thing that we saw is that in the first quarter of 2016, there were a bunch of sales, new development sales, 432 Park, 157, et cetera, where you have people spending gargantuan amounts of money on these units, many of them investor units, and they're closing in the first quarter of 2016. They were put into contract last year. So one, it's not necessarily reflective of what's happening in the market. It's
I
not
love that word, gargantuan. I can't even say it.
Thank you. College served me well. Anyways, so it's not necessarily reflective of what's happening in the market today. And those huge sales are indeed bringing up the average statistic, and not so much the median, but it can skew the median as well.
We know to pat ourselves on the back, me, Tony, Stribling, our whole organization, that's one of the reasons we have this show, is because real estate, as I'm always yammering on about it on the show, is becoming such a more complicated thing now in New York. It's just, you can't just throw out a simple statistic or categorize a neighborhood or even a street or a block anymore.
That's true. Another thing with these market reports, and let me just stay with the market reports for another instance, is that most of them aggregate citywide data. So they'll pull everything from, Wall Street all the way up to 145th Street or whatever the particular firm's defining parameters are. And they'll say, well, the average price was $2,252,581 or whatever they quoted. And you'll say, well, okay, that may be on a citywide basis, but what about Billionaires Row on 57th Street? That's completely skewing the statistics. So what's happening in Uptown above 110th Street, or what's happening just between 5th and Park Avenue, between 72nd and 77th Street, right? So one thing you have to do to really accurately interpret what's happening in the city is not only break down statistics and numbers and data by neighborhood, but you have to break it down by sub-neighborhood as well. So, 15 or by building, 50 Central Park West is in a category of its own. 157 is in a category of its own. It may not necessarily hold true for the rest of Billionaires Row or 57th Street, especially, looking, east or west of, 8th Avenue. So
data is good, but it's up to us to, I hope this is the correct word, extrapolate it properly.
Sure,
and
you
make
have
the best use
you have to
it.
draw your own. You have to draw conclusions for yourself, and I think this is, what's really great about Stribling is that we have a broker population that is extremely experienced, from those who have been, brokers for 40 years to those who are younger brokers who really know how to leverage technology. Is that the brokers at Stribling bring the wealth database and the knowledge database with them, and when you combine that with technology, you have a really wonderful understanding of what's happening in the city, rather than just looking at a generic market report produced by any other firm.
Well, I'm always going to go to the sports analogy. So you have like the modern way of looking at things like Moneyball, and then you have the Clint Eastwood movie Trouble with the Curve. But they're both right. And you have to absolutely look at the changes in technology.
I think I know what you mean.
Well, it's changes in technology in the evolving world that cannot be denied. But you then cannot ignore somebody with a great amount of experience that just knows about the nuances of a specific building you may ask about.
Absolutely. And I think in particular in the New York market, what you see, or what I've experienced in the New York market, is that brokers often win deals or win exclusives or make sales or bring qualified buyers to a sale because of the relationships that they have with their clients and because of the relational aspect of being a broker and being a high-quality broker. In other parts of the country where there aren't necessarily as many brokers or as many experienced brokers, the data plays a different role than it does necessarily in New York in terms of winning those exclusives. It plays a much bigger role than just having a strong relationship with your large network or your large client base already that many of the brokers in New York already have.
Yeah, I have a client I sold a pied-à-terre to in New York City, and he bought a vacation property in this little town in Delaware, Lewis, Delaware. And they have like one broker that rules that whole domain because it's very cookie cutter. All of the homes are lovely, but everything is relatively the same. And you can really fire out the statistics and the data, and it's going to be pretty simplistic.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
There's not going to be much of a price variance in any way.
And another dynamic of data in New York is that we have such a wide variety and array of buildings. I mean, there are something like 106,581 buildings that real estate professionals should be looking at any one given time in Manhattan alone, not even Brooklyn or Queens, et cetera. And when you're looking at these statistics, it doesn't tell the story of, or when you're looking at a particular listing on, your listing service, it doesn't tell the story of what condition is that one bedroom in, or what condition is that two bedroom in. Why is it listed for a lower price than this apartment, which is one block away, which has a similar floor plan, but maybe in triple mint condition and is there triple the price? So these reports and statistics don't necessarily get into the dirty details of the units themselves, which is where the true value of the broker comes in.
The uniqueness of every building and neighborhood.
Absolutely.
Like the Street Easy ads, right? You look out a window and you're facing a brick wall.
Right.
But you're in New York City.
But you're in New York City. So, for people that are moving to New York City, something that I found as a person coming from the West Coast, you're moving to the city for the city itself. The city itself is the amenity. I'm not necessarily so concerned that I have a 70-foot lap pool at the bottom of my building. I'm concerned that, there are 15 restaurants nearby that are rated, by a Michelin star, by the Michelin Guide. So New York, how do we put a value on the city of New York itself? How do we put a value on Park Avenue? It's impossible to do.
It's nice to have
and then you say, well, how do you put a value on emerging and sort of growing neighborhoods like Harlem? So Harlem is seeing a huge boom of interest in the mid-tier market that isn't necessarily reflected in the numbers as most people look at them.
Exactly. I'm going to give a free plug to Marcus Samuelson's restaurant, Red Rooster, up in Harlem. It's fantastic.
Fabulous.
They have great jazz.
Dinosaur Barbecue as well.
Yes, Dinosaur BBQ.
And
that's
Sylvia's.
all the way west.
Under the West Side Highway.
We're going to do a whole other show on food.
Don't forget Sylvia's, my friend Sylvia.
I'm starting to get really hungry. Geoff, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll have you come back and visit us again soon.
Thank you, Geoff.
Fabulous. Anytime.
Talk more about data.